So, if you're a parent, have you ever had to say no to your kids? It's not easy, is it? Some of us grew up in a no kind of environment, and we said, when I grow up, I will do everything I can not to say no, to try to find some way to turn every no into a yes for my kids. And you're working hard at it. But if you asked your kids how it's working for them, what would they say? Would they say they've never heard a no from you? No matter how we frame it, no is often what is heard, isn't it? I am now once more a grandpa with a very mature and extremely bright 2.5-year-old grandson. I'm enjoying watching our grandson's parent try to do no in a better way than it was done to them. They're doing awesome. They found another word for no that doesn't sound as harsh, but means the same thing. No matter how hard they try, sometimes I see our grandson feeling a very direct and firm, clear no. And I'm discovering that, at least for this grandpa, it's even harder to say no as a grandfather than it was as a dad. There's this internal pressure to compete in yes kinds of ways with the other side of the family. At 2.5 years old, our grandson has already sat in the driver's seat, well, in front of his uncle, of a tractor, a front-end loader, a road grader, and has operated the levers while the motor was running. And he knows how to drive them. Just ask him. I'm preparing for the day, probably when he's 4 years old, when he thinks he can let pushover grandpa get him to drive the car because mom and dad keep saying no. What I envision is he will have been begging me to drive for months, and they've begging them to drive for months. They've kept putting him off, trying to say no without saying no. And one day, while we're visiting there, after buttering me up with hugs for a day or two, he'll run ahead of me on our way to the car, jump into the driver's seat, and say, "Today is my turn, Grandpa." You know how hard that will be, not to find a way not to say no? Back in the day in the country, there was an easy yes to that, right? You put them on your lap or on the seat in front of you, let them stand on the seat in front of you, let them steer with your hidden hand at the bottom of the wheel, right? But for some reason, they don't allow us to do that anymore. No matter how hard we try to say yes, sometimes a good parent has to say no. If you're a school teacher, it doesn't take too long to discern that there are some kids who just might not have had no said to them enough, or in the right kind of way. Or a child who perhaps has clear signs of mental, emotional health challenges and through no fault of her own finds it extra hard to process no well. It's hard to hear no, especially when God says no. We're working our way through the life of the great King David, God's king with a heart for God. We're looking at his life through the lens of one of his own statements in the book of Psalms, a statement that we've shown is the closest thing to a life motto that he has. Psalm 16:8, "I have set the Lord always before me. I see him ahead of me, calling me, drawing me along, but not just ahead of me, because he is at my right hand, which is actually the place of authority over me, I will not be shaken." So how does a no from God fit into our not be shaken experience? Sometimes at the heart of our not be shaken struggles is a no that we're feeling from God, right? How do you process no from God when you're told that God is saying no about something? Do you stop seeing him before you and setting him above you? Do you blame it on other people? It can't be God saying no. God would say yes to this because this is what I feel is good and right. Do you just fold your arms and clam up and play passive-aggressive with God? I won't play with you until you come through my way. Do you plug your ears? La da la da la da la da. I can't hear you. We're going to skip ahead in our journey with David this morning, way ahead. 2 Samuel chapter 6. One of the questions we have as David takes over the throne. Remember, 1 Samuel is the story of Saul's kingship. Even though David has been anointed king halfway through, it's still Saul that's king. 2 Samuel, David becomes king, and now it's his. So one of the questions we have as we hit 2 Samuel is, will David be any different than Saul? Will being king change David? So let's do a really quick survey of the first 5 chapters of 2 Samuel with that question in mind to set us up for the account that we're going to process today. Right from the get-go, chapter 1 of 2 Samuel. Turn in your Bibles there and just quickly review it as I talk about it. You can do 2 things at once. We see a different kind of king. David does not begin his reign by saying, yes, finally Saul is out of the picture. It's my turn to show what I can do. How did David begin his reign? He begins with lament. Not lament the way we tend to think of lament, being transparent and dumping out our feelings of frustration about things that are not going our way. Lament the way David does it and leads us in doing it well in many of his psalms. Lament for the one who sees and sets God always before him is not about David at all. David laments that in the death of God, or in the death of Saul, God's anointed one has been cut off. God's name among the nations, among God's enemies, is being mocked, and God's glory has become tarnished. David leads the people in repenting. You see, lament that does not become repent Here we go. A lament that does not become repent is not really lament at all. Saul is now gone, and the first thing David does is to point people to the God who is before them and to setting him above them. He wants to make sure that it's not about him, but about the God who is over all, the God he has set before him and sees before him, and to come before him in humble repentance. And as the story moves on, chapter 2, even after Saul is gone, that doesn't mean the Saul party is gone. David is put on the throne of Judah, which is the southern third of Israel, roughly, for another 7 years. 7 more years. David is king, but just over Judah. He still doesn't have it all. And chapter 3 begins this way. It's really important to see. The war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. Who dat? Okay, sorry. I thought somebody was trying to talk to me. The war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. David grew stronger and stronger while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. That's chapters 3 and 4. For 2 chapters, we read about this internal political battle for David to become king over all of Israel. But even through all of these battles and the manipulating and maneuvering, David does not see himself winning when Saul's supporters start losing. And then in chapter 5, when David becomes king over all of Israel, he does 3 things. Number 1, he conquers Jerusalem. Jerusalem, which will become Zion, the city of God, the capital city of God's rule over the world. And number 2, he builds himself, a big palace in Jerusalem. Of course, what else does a king with a big palace do? Well, he has to fill the palace with more wives so he can have more kids. Yeah, it's complicated. And then after establishing his base in Jerusalem, David wins a battle against, of course, the Philistines, just like he did when he first came on the scene against Goliath. It's very interesting, especially in light of what we'll see today, what the text says about how David frames this victory over the Philistines. Chapter 5, verse 20, it says, "So David went to Baal Perazim, and there he defeated them, the Philistines, And he said, as the waters break out, the Lord has broken out against my enemies before me. So that place was called Baal Perazim. God does what? God breaks out. What does Baal Perazim mean? It means breakout of God. 4 times we're told that God breaks out. Remember that. David's not be shaken hope is finally paying off and becoming his not be shaken experience. God is alive. God's on the move. A God outbreak is finally happening. David and God's people are finally experiencing God's yes in ways they never have before. And then, shockingly, in the 2 episodes we're going to look at today, chapter 6 and chapter 7, David has 2 experiences back to back where God says no. Directly, definitively, dramatically. No. To David. When from everything we can tell, his motives are right. Now, these seeds obviously don't tell us everything about why and when and how God says no. But I think from these 2 chapters, we see 2 overarching answers to the question of why God says no. So let's look first of all at episode 1 and chapter 6. David starts by setting up an event, a memorable event to help God's people see that it's not about David. It's about setting God before them. It's not just I have put the Lord before me. We will put the Lord before us. Now, that's a good thing, isn't it? And David does the right thing to declare that. And memorable it is. Just not the way David planned it to be. Chapter 6, verse 1. David again brought together all the able young men of Israel, 30,000. David's team has grown. His army has grown. Who are these men? These are the men that he's trained for and led into battle. They're his team, the best and the brightest. He wants to show them and to use them to show all of Israel how to do it right. How setting God before us begins. It's time to bring home the ark. Verse 2. He and all his men went to Baalah in Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim on the ark. The ark. Remember the ark? The ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, it was called. The ark was a gold-plated box that God had told them to make way back in Mount Sinai, where he had met them. It was kept in the heart of the tabernacle, their portable worship center, the center of the worship of God. The ark that in the book of Joshua, remember, as the priests are walking in front of all the people carrying the ark, they step into the water's parted, and as the ark is standing they are standing in the middle of the Jordan with the ark, everybody walks through. The presence of God is leading them into the land of God's promise. The ark was just over a meter long and about 3/4 of a meter wide and high. And inside the ark and on top of the ark were some tangible items that reminded them of who this God who was among them is. The God who called them, the God who they served, and the God who was giving himself to him, or giving himself to them, who he really is. The tablets of stone from Mount Sinai, on which the 10 Commandments, the core of God's law, were written, called them to remember that he is the God who prescribes how to follow and obey him for our good. His truth is prescriptive. It is not just descriptive or suggestive. He is the God with a law about how to live life and how to live well under him. The rod of Aaron, Moses' brother, was in there to show that he is the God who presides, who rules over us and directs us in his way. It wasn't a human leader they were following, not Moses, not Joshua, not even David. He is the God who presides. In the box was a jar of manna, reminding them that he is the God who provides, just as he did through the dry years of the wilderness. And not only does he provide a way through the wilderness, on the lid of the ark were two cherubim that represented partially, that is part of the annual celebration of the Day of Atonement. He's a God who provides a way back. The other big thing about the ark was that it was a reminder that he is the God who is here. He is present among his people. The ark of God was not a good luck charm. It was not a spiritual magic box. It was a tangible symbol of everything God had done and would do for them, in them, and through them as they surrendered to him, obeyed him, and followed him fully. The ark and how they handled the ark was to be a tangible demonstration that they are putting the Lord always in everything before them. It's what David wants to declare, and it's how he wants to start off his reign. This is exactly the right thing to do. And so, beginning of verse 3, we read, they set the ark on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. The house of Abinadab, what's it doing there and how did it get there? We have to see how the ark got to the house of Abinadab. It was in the days just before King Saul. 1 Samuel chapter 4, you can read it later. In a battle against the Philistines, they had used the ark to try to get a military win. God saw that they were using him and not surrendering to him, and it doesn't go well. And the Philistines steal the ark of God's presence, which doesn't go well for them either, although they get it in a way God's people don't. And so they return the ark to the city of Beth Shemesh. And the people of Beth Shemesh are so happy because they think the ark of God will be a good luck charm through which they can get the blessing of God. But it doesn't go well for them either. And at least they draw the right conclusion. In 1 Samuel chapter 6, it says, "Who can stand in the presence of the Lord, this holy God?" It's the right message. And they say, "Get this thing out of here." Can't do it well. And it ends up on the property of Abinadab. And what's the next thing God's people do? They say, "This isn't working for us. We need a king." They choose Saul. And from that time on, during the entire reign of Saul, the ark of God becomes a relic. Stored, but not touched. Probably in whatever their version of a sea can was. Or perhaps a museum-type storage hut, a cute little chapel where it becomes a tourist attraction artifact. Look what they did in the olden days. But now, finally, David wants to bring back the ark of the covenant of the Lord their God. And to make sure it's done well, David takes these 30,000 able young men to lead the parade. I mean, what a way to develop national pride, right? Number one, you honor the heroes of battle. Elevate them in front of the people. Number two, at the same time, he's discipling them, helping them to understand that it's God who gives the victory. It's actually God's victory for himself because this is his kingdom. And, well, yeah, with the troops escorting the ark, David's making sure the Philistines won't get any stupid ideas to try to catch them off guard and ruin the party. David's thought this all through well. So, middle of verse 3. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, where the ark was, were guiding the ark, the cart with the ark of God in it. And Ahio was walking in front of it. They're bringing the ark back to the center of it all, and they do it with joyful celebration. Verse 5. David and all Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord with castanets, harps, lyres, timbrels, sistrums, and cymbals. Can you see it? God, once again, at the center, where he should be, for this 11-kilometer parade. This is an all-day celebration. And then, in a big way, God says no. When they came to the threshing floor of Nakon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark of God because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore, God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark of God. It's like, what? What just happened here? Well, take a look at verse 8. We see how David interprets what happened. Verse 8. Then David was angry because the Lord's wrath had what? Broken out against Uzzah. And to this day, that place is called Perez Uzzah. He calls it an outbreak of God against Uzzah. What does Perez Uzzah mean? It means outbreak against Uzzah. It's very clear in the flow of the story. This is another outbreak of God against his people, just like his win over his enemies was an outbreak of God for his people. This is God saying no in a big way. So what do we do with that? Aren't they declaring God as their sovereign leader at the center? Well, on the surface of it, they are. And aren't they doing it with worship, exuberant, expressive, alive worship? The question is this really authentic worship? Now, first, let's get off the table what this does not say about God. This is not about God being arbitrary and unpredictable. Unmanageable, yes, but not unpredictable. What God did was very predictable. God is doing exactly what he said he would do. So let's look back at this a little more closely. How has David moved the ark of God? Which means, how has he treated the presence of God? On the face of it, it seems like they're doing it carefully and respectfully, just as God deserved. But who was it that God said was to be handling the ark? By David's soldier leaders? No, the ark was to be handled by the priests and the priests alone. Not military leaders, not even the king. What else does it say? It says in verse 3, they set the ark of God on a new cart. Well, that's good thinking. It's a special cart. It's brand new. It's never been used for anything else. In theological language, they would say this ark is holy. It's sanctified. It's set apart for this use and this use alone. They are treating the ark of God's presence with respect, reverence, making it special, aren't they? But how had God said the ark was to be moved? It was to be carried by priests alone, not carted. And even worse than that, in putting the ark on a new cart, check out 1 Samuel chapter 6, verse 7, they're moving the cart the same way the Philistines had moved the ark. And the description concludes with what in God's mind is the central problem. The end of verse 3. Uzzah and Ahio were guiding the cart with the ark of God in it. They were what? They were guiding, leading the ark. Nobody guides the ark. The ark guides you. Just like in Joshua 3 and the crossing of the Jordan. And then in verse 6, when the cows pulling the cart stumbled and the cart jerked, Uzzah does exactly what was clearly not to be done. He reaches out and handles the ark with human hands. Not even priests touched the ark. They carried it with poles that were threaded through hoops, so they never touched the ark. And the people once again are given the lesson that the people of Beth Shemesh had learned. Who can stand in the presence of the Lord, this holy God? So, are they really worshiping as they move the ark? No, because worship, authentic worship, is a leadership issue. It's a declaration that I am living in, I'm living under, I'm living for God as my leader. I'm living in obedience to Him. Worship is saying yes to the leadership of God, that I am accepting and delighting and accepting His word as my truth. For a short period of time, I worked several years ago on the management team in government service. The director of the department I worked in had a leadership trainer that he wanted all of his managers to be trained by. This guy had been a head trainer for all of Canada's military fighter pilots. He was a very colorful man, very insightful man, who was sort of bucking some of the popular management theories of the day, particularly the idea of authority, what authority means and how we use it. He was not at all advocating a my way or the highway kind of leadership, always holding up the authority card. And he articulated well how different styles were appropriate for different situations. But one thing he said has stuck with me, not so much about leading people, but about God's leadership of me. He said, authority only matters when we disagree. Ever thought about that? We can talk all we want about team, we can talk about collaboration, and we should, but there will come times when we disagree, when someone has to call the shots. How do we respond then? When God says no, I can try to justify what I did, I can try to frame what I did as coming from a right heart, but if we're not doing what God says and the way God says, what does that say about my heart? Am I really putting Him before me? Have I really put Him at my right hand, at the place of authority? And so God does what God does. God breaks through. There are so many messages God is sending them and us in this story. Number one, the God who is in control is not a God I can control, even by doing the right things. Yes, in many ways, David's heart was right, and he's doing the right thing, sort of. But God is reminding David that to put God before him is to do things his way. So easily and so quickly, I want to use God for my goals, to fulfill my dreams. Doesn't work, friends. I can't use God for my purposes, even if I learn to use the language of God to frame my goals as God's purposes, because God knows my heart. We even do it in how we think about prayer, right? We tend to think that if we say the right words and have what we think is the right heart and good goals, God will answer and move things my way. And when God says no, or at least doesn't say yes, what we need to learn to ask more is, am I authentically engaging God, or am I trying to manage God? God's goal is to be glorified in us and through us, not to be used by us. And often it's when God says no that our bent towards trying to manage God is exposed, isn't it? That's why I hate that line, prayer works. Prayer what? Prayer works? What do we mean by that? Prayer doesn't work. God works. As we submit to Him, surrender to Him, release it to Him, which means recognizing His authority over it and over me. Yes, we need to pray, but not in a sense to make prayer work. And ultimately, we only really know we have surrendered to Him by how we respond when He says no. Because prayer should first of all change my heart. So David moves through this several phases of processing this no from God. He knows that, once again, other people have suffered because of his failure. It happens over and over again in David's leadership life, doesn't it? David's first response is what? He's angry. Verse 8. Then David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah, and to this day that place is called Breakout against Uzzah. Who's David angry at? Well, it's not really clear, is it? We assume he's angry at God, but could it be more than that? You see, anger is an emotion that rises up inside of us, and what happens is we pick the target for that anger, right? We often focus on the person we think caused it without thinking about what it is that's really causing our anger. What is anger? Craig Massey years ago said, anger is the negative emotion that rises within us when our self-centered position is threatened. Ooh. What goal of mine is being blocked? What desire of mine is not being fulfilled? But could it be that David is also, in his anger, becoming angry at himself and his failure? It would seem he at least moves in that direction because his anger turns to fear. Verse 9, David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, "How can the ark of the Lord ever come to me?" He was not willing to take the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. Instead, he took it to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. And the third thing he does is also a good thing. David takes a tea. Time out. It's called waiting. Verse 11. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire household. And in this pause, as David thinks through what really happened, he goes into the mode we've talked about a number of times during this teaching on David, a time of reflection. And he realizes God is not really against him. He does want to bless him. Just as he's blessing the house of Obed-Edom. Verse 12, now King David was told, the Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom, everything he has, because of the ark of God. And so David went to bring up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. When those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fatted calf. Wearing a linen ephod, David was dancing before the Lord with all his might, while he and all Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sound of trumpets. It's interesting. In both parts of this movement of the ark, David dances before God. One dance is judged, the other one's commended. Both times people are rejoicing in the context of worship, but one of them is manufactured and human-centered. One of them is authentic and God-centered. We could spend a lot of time talking about that one, right? Perhaps we should spend more time thinking about it than we do. I was thinking this week about one of the experiences I had as a young pastor. I was responsible for getting our elders at the time to serve people communion, and I had booked 2 elders to help that Sunday. The Sunday morning, just before church, one of the elders came in. He was an older gentleman. He was a railway engineer, just a really nice guy. And he came in and he says, "Mel, I'm sorry, I can't serve communion today." Like this, just before the service. He says, "I'm sorry, I can't serve communion today. God and I have been fighting about something, and at this point, he's not winning, so I can't serve." And my first thought was, whoa, this guy gets it. That's authentic worship. And everyone joins David in worship. Well, everyone except one person, David's wife, Michal. As the ark of the Lord, verse 16 of 2 Samuel 6, as the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window, and when she saw David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. They brought the ark of the Lord, set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it, and David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. After he had finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, he blessed the Lord, or the people, in the name of the Lord Almighty. Then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of Israelites, both men and women, and all the people went to their homes. When David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, how the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would. Michal's reaction exposes who she really is. What is she called? 3 times in this passage. She's called daughter of Saul. That's not just a statement of her lineage. That's a statement about her heart. She thinks David's a fool for dancing before the Lord. He's not doing what kings do. Kings have people dance before them. Kings act like gods. But David said, verse 21, David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his household when he appointed me the ruler of God's people. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor. And Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. This is not about whether we should dance in worship, okay? This is about when any outward expression, singing, raising hands, dancing, is appropriate in worship. David is clear. It's not about the outward form. It's about the heart. It's about humbling myself before God, not making myself look good in front of people or God. David's audience is not cool people. His audience is God. And David realizes that it's not the cool people who will get it and get into it. It's the slave girls. They know about being humbled. By the way, whose attention are we wanting? On social media, in church, in your workplace. We want the attention of cool people, don't we? Several years ago, when everyone was first getting into social media, a friend of ours from the past put on a message board that her husband had been taken to the hospital for a serious procedure. And she said, in this text, she said, I think it would encourage him if some of his friends from the past would text him. And she gave his cell number to text. Almost immediately, on this social media message board, there was this reply to everyone, gushy, flowery messages. But she had said, text him. LaDonna said to me, look at this. I'm presuming they also texted him, but does it feel to you like they're putting it out there to everyone to make themselves look good to others? We do that way more than we want to admit, right? Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. And so often we turn humble into humble brag. So what does this chapter teach us about God when God says no? I think the one message of this chapter is God says no to give me an opportunity to say a deeper and more comprehensive yes to him. Sometimes it may not be about a specific wrong action. It may simply be about our hearts. We are so quick to defend ourselves and say, my heart was right, but there will always, this side of heaven, when there be a time when parts of our heart are not fully aligned with God. Sometimes parts we're not even aware of. I'm sure I've used this line before, but it's one of my favorites. Without trials, says Larry Crabb, without trials, and one way of looking at trials is God saying no, right? Without trials, only spoiled brats would enter heaven, and that would turn heaven into hell. It's out of experiences like this that David learns to pray things like, search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me, and know my anxious thoughts, and see if there's any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. It's only when we stop reacting, start fearing, and enter a healthy step of reflecting and waiting that we can hear the deeper yes God is inviting us to say to Him. Anyway, God might be wanting you to accept a no from Him, to declare to both Him and your own heart that you're willing to say yes in a deeper way. Any dream you need to let go? Any desire you need to reevaluate? Any demand you have from people or God that you need to confront? Any right you think you have that you need to reconsider? David has learned his lesson. He's back again to leading the people and putting God before him, submitting to God, not controlling God. And so we come to chapter 7. We're just going to survey this one briefly. Even though when it comes to the story that God is writing in David and for David and through David, chapter 7 is the center. Chapter 7 is the high point of David's story. The high point of David's story in the story. And yet, interestingly enough, this high point of David's story includes another big no from God. David has one more plan to lead the people in seeing God before them and setting God over them. He built his palace, but in order that everyone can see it's all about God, he wants to build just as nice a house for God. Chapter 7, verse 1. After the king was settled in his palace and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him, he said to Nathan the prophet, "Here I am living in a house of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent." And David goes to his new pastor, Nathan, the prophet. Samuel is dead, right? The new prophet is emerging, whom David is learning to trust and respect, and he tests his idea off Nathan. And Nathan says what every pastor really wants to say. They really do. Amazing idea. Go for it. Verse 3. Nathan replied to the king, "Whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you." This is a no-brainer. It's as obvious as serving waffles at a waffle brunch. David says, "Yeah, that's what I thought too." And then God steps in and says, "No." Verse 4. But that night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan, the prophet, saying, "Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up from Egypt to this day. I've been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. Wherever I have moved with all of the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their rulers whom I commanded to shepherd my people, 'Why have you not built a house for me?' Now, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all of your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth. I will provide a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore as they did at the beginning and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and when you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands, but my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I have removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." We don't read this chapter very often. But this chapter is one of the mountain peaks, the high points in the story God is writing. It's one of the core covenants of God. Covenant with Noah, with Abraham, with Moses and Joshua, and now David. David, I love your heart, but that's not my plan. I'll get my house, but you're not the guy to build my house. Now, there are several reasons God alludes to as to why, even though David has a heart to do it, he might not be the guy to do it, and we've seen this, and we can see this throughout David's story. Number one, David, your job, the best way you can bring glory for me is under my direction to make my land a secure place for my people. To build a palace while you're doing that, you're going to lose your focus and lose my plan. Number two, David making a house for me at this point would send the wrong signal. I've never had a house. I've never asked for a house. I don't need a house. In some ways, that might just send the signal that faith, the God part, belongs in the religious sphere. I am Lord over everything. There will be a time and a place, but not by you and not now. Well, those are part of it. But they're not the really big reason God gives for saying no. God tells David clearly why he says no, and it's totally not what we would expect. David, let's talk about you and house. What I want you to become known for the rest of history is not about the house you built for me, but about the house that I am building for you and through you. And God makes this covenant with David to build his house and to prove that it doesn't have a hint of being transactional. If you build me a house, I'll build your house. God makes it a total one-way covenant. And it's in this covenant of God with David that God further clarifies his original promise from Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, about the seed of a woman who will crush the head of Satan. To Noah, he promised, I will never again flood the earth with judgment. I will provide a way back. To Abram, he said that the promise will be from his line of that all people of the world will be blessed. And to Moses and Joshua, the covenant of the law, and then the land. And now David, it's from your house, your line. I will build a house, a people over whom I will reign, with your descendant, in whom I will dwell, as a house not made by hands. Oh yes, he's talking about Solomon, David's son, who will build a temple, but he's also alluding to something much bigger. David, I have much bigger plans for you than for you to build a house for me. I am building a house for you and through you that will last forever and will one day rule over everything. What does this tell us about when God says no and why God says no and how God says no? God says no not just to invite us to say a bigger yes to him. God says no. Oh, thought I had more. God says no to help us see his way bigger yes to us. A yes from him that is far bigger than our dreams, far grander than our plans, far superior to any of our desires and demands. Which leads us to another reason David was not the right guy to build the temple. We don't read it in 1 Samuel chapter 7, but because 1 Samuel 7 just records what God told Nathan to tell David. We don't know when, we don't know how, it's sometime later, but in the book of 1 Chronicles, we come to the time the temple is being built. David's about to pass on, and he reveals to his son Solomon what else God told him about why he is not the guy to build the house. 1 Chronicles chapter 22, verse 7, David said to Solomon, my son, I had it in my heart to build a house for the name of the Lord my God. But this word of the Lord came to me, you have shed much blood and have fought many wars. You are not to build a house for my name because you have shed much blood on the earth. But you will have a son who will be a man of peace and rest. I will give him rest from all his enemies on everything. His name will be Solomon, and I will grant Israel peace and quiet during his reign. He is the one who will build a house for my name. He will be my son, and I will be his father, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom over Israel forever. So is this saying that David's shedding of blood was wrong? No. But you got to wonder, as we read the rest of the story, if what it's saying, especially in light of the blood sacrifices that will be made in that temple, if what God is saying to David is it's not through your military victories, your battles, and your wins that my people have my presence. The shedding of blood to which the sacrifices of this temple will point have nothing to do with what I do to become part of the house of God. They have everything to do with the shedding of his own blood that your descendant, my son Jesus, will do for you. Many centuries later, in the final week of Jesus' life, it begins with Jesus entering the city of David, Jerusalem, in a parade with people bowing down to him as king, saying, Hosanna to the Son of God, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. They believed he was that, but they had no idea that he would become that by absorbing in himself all of the consequences of every single no I have said to God, so that God could say yes to you. The cross of Jesus is God, the loving Father, saying no to the Son he loves so he could say yes fully and completely to you and include you in that circle of love. If everything we heard in life was yes, we wouldn't need Jesus. We'd see no need for God's bigger yes, and sometimes what we need to see is that it's in the no's of life, maybe even through a no from God, that God is wanting to say to us, I have a much bigger yes for you than what you are kicking against, what you feel you are losing, what you are demanding, what you are doing because you can, to try to feel a yes from God. Sometimes God says no, so you will turn your eyes in a new way to Jesus, his ultimate yes to you. God said no to his dear Son so he could say yes to you. Why does God say no? I would suggest there's only two overall reasons. Number one, to get a deeper yes from me to him. And number two, to help me see his bigger yes to me. Worship team, why don't you come forward? And as they lead us in one last song, or before they lead us in one last song, I sang in my heart a couple of times a pointed question that Matt Mayer asks in one of his newer songs. That I think it's a question we need to ask when we feel ourselves God saying no. He says, is there room in your heart for God to write his story? You can come as you are, but it may set you apart when you make room in your heart and trade your dreams for his glory. As we close, even in the no I'm experienced, would you declare to God that you realize he is a good, good Father and has loved you with an everlasting love? Let's stand and sing that song.